Welcome everyone. My name is Robert Crawford and I'm an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. It's a pleasure to be able to present this study on the effect of COVID-19 on household energy demand to you today, wherever you might be in the world. When this study originated, it was becoming clear that a move to working and studying from home due to COVID-19 lockdowns was likely to be resulting in an increase in household energy demand. This was particularly obvious to me because my kids began using their laptops and tablets for much of the day, just when I thought they couldn't possibly use them any more than they already were. So this study set out to determine the effect that COVID-19 related lockdowns has had on household energy demand. As we know, the World Health Organization announced the spread of coronavirus as a global pandemic on the 9th of March this year. Over 1.3 million people have now died from COVID-19, which is a disease caused by the virus. To limit the spread of COVID-19, many countries began to enforce strict lockdown rules, with around 30% of the global population put into lockdown at the peak, and more than 80% of all workplaces either partly or fully closed. Over time, these lockdowns became even more restrictive. For example, in the Australian state of Victoria, a state of emergency was announced on the 16th of March this year, and from the 21st of March, Victoria, along with the rest of Australia, moved into Stage 1 restrictions, which limited social gatherings and banned many facilities from opening. School holidays were also brought forward and workers were asked to work from home. From the 31st of March, the Victorian Government announced a mandatory stay-at-home order as part of Stage 3 restrictions, which meant that households were only allowed to leave their homes for 4 reasons: work or study, exercise, shopping for supplies, and medical care or caregiving. On the 15th of April, school-based learning was replaced with remote learning for Victorian school students. With workplaces and schools shut down, there was a reduced demand for energy in these buildings, up to around 25% on average. However, as many of the work and study activities that householders would usually leave home for began to be conducted at home, household energy demand increased due to greater demand for heating, cooling, lighting, appliance use, etc. For example, residential electricity consumption in the state of Victoria increased by 20% for the months of April to June compared to the previous year. This is to be expected. Previous research has shown the link between electricity use and the number of occupants and hours of occupancy of a house. There's been several studies that have considered the demand for energy during the COVID-19 pandemic. And these have predominantly looked at energy use at a state or city scale or at a whole of sector level, such as the residential sector. Many of them just rely on households' perceptions of energy use rather than actual household energy data. One study of actual energy demand was conducted on 400 New York City apartments, which showed around a 4 to 7% daily increase in demand during their stay-at-home order earlier in the year. However, there's been very little or no research to have explored the effect of the COVID-19 lockdown and the resultant change to household occupancy on the demand for energy within individual households, particularly in Australia. So the aim of this study was to assess the effect of COVID-19 related lockdowns on an Australian household's operational energy demand. In addition to this, it was also to explore the main contributors to any change in energy demand during the lockdown period. To do this, the study considers the electricity and natural gas demand within a typical Australian house located just outside of Melbourne. The house has a net conditioned floor area of 254 square metres and a reticulated electricity and natural gas supply. Electricity is used for cooling, lighting, oven cooking and appliances, while natural gas is used for hot water heating, stovetop cooking and ducted heating. There are 6 occupants that regularly reside within the house, including 2 adults and 4 children. 3 children are of high school age, whilst the 4th is of preschool age. The 3 high school age children are typically away from the house from 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. weekdays, and the preschool age child is typically away from the house for 15 hours a week. One of the adult occupants is away from the house during the day on weekdays, and the other is predominantly home-based during the day and out of the house most evenings of work. The hours and extent of occupancy is important to understand, and it's the changes to these that may help to understand the reason for changes in energy demand within the house. So what were the changes related to lockdown? Well, the 3 high school age children undertook remote learning from home from the 15th of April to the 8th of June. During this period, each child used a laptop computer to engage in online classes, communicate with their teachers and peers, and access schoolwork for the majority of the time between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. weekdays. The government directions to work from home from the 25th of March also meant that both adults began working from home regularly from this date. This meant that both adults relied on a computer and internet access to conduct their work activities. Electricity usage Data in 30-minute increments was sourced from the electricity distributor for the period 1st of March to the end of June. Natural gas bills were also obtained, but they were only available on a monthly basis due to the lack of incremental metering for gas use. And these bills were obtained for the period of March, April, May and June this year. To determine the influence of lockdown on energy demand, this data was then compared to energy usage data for the same period of the previous 6 years. Now, the same period was used to minimise the influence of weather on energy demand. In addition to this, daily minimum and maximum dry bulb temperatures were obtained from the Bureau of Meteorology's Climate Data online portal and compared to ensure there were no dramatic differences in weather within the period of analysis over the 7 years. One of the most obvious and biggest changes to the demand for electricity during the lockdown periods was the increase in the use of technology for working and learning from home. This is likely to have led to an increase in energy demand for tablets, laptops, phones, etc. Because individual circuits within the household aren't separately metered, it wasn't possible to attribute any quantity of electricity to these individual uses. So to get an indication of the possible influence of the increased use of these devices on the household's electricity demand, information on the amount of data downloaded through the household's internet connection was used as a proxy. Previous research has shown that there's been a strong correlation between data use and electricity demand. Daily data use was obtained from the internet service provider, but was only available for the 12 months prior to the lockdown period. The data collected showed a total of 1,214 kilowatt hours of energy was used from the period of March to June 2020. This equates to an average daily electricity demand of around about 10 kilowatt hours. And as the graph here shows, this is around about a 26% increase on the average electricity demand for the same time period over the 6 previous years. Electricity demand in previous years has been fairly constant, despite a slight upward trend in 2019, which saw around about a 12% increase on the average for the previous 5 years. However, the annual moving 3-year average only began to rise significantly this year. So it's clear that there's definitely a considerable increase in electricity demand for the March to June period this year. Breaking this data down into a monthly basis, this graph shows that for March this year, there was only a slight increase in electricity demand compared to 2019, around 2.2%, but a 12.5 to 23% increase over every other year. However, as lockdown commenced in late March, changes in electricity demand weren't expected to be significant for the month of March. The most dramatic increase in electricity demand came in April, with a 31 to 54% increase compared to the previous 6 years. And this is when remote learning commenced. May also saw a significant increase in electricity demand compared to previous years, from 21 to 29%. Electricity demand was lower than typical in June 2014 and June 2016 because the house was unoccupied for half of these months. Compared to other years, there was only a slight increase in electricity demand in June, 3.5 to 18.5%, and this is most likely due to the fact that school reopened on the 9th of June and remote learning ceased. Comparing data on natural gas demand was found to be quite problematic because of the variance in billing cycles, the length and the timing from year to year. However, for the period from early March to mid-June, the results showed a range from 90 to 142 megajoules per day for the time period across the 7 years. And the 2020 data didn't show a significant difference compared to previous years. And this was expected because there was no major change to demand for cooking, hot water use or heating during the lockdown period. Detailed analysis of the weather data also showed no major change in the minimum and maximum temperatures compared to previous years or the number of heating degree days. So it was assumed that device use is responsible for a large proportion of the increased electricity use within the household during lockdown. The 3 high school aged children had access to 3 devices each, a laptop, a tablet and a mobile phone at all times of the day. And both adults also did the majority of their work on a laptop computer. While an increase in the use of some household appliances, such as televisions, and lighting is expected with a higher occupancy, the most significant change in occupant activities during lockdown was the increased use of devices. This is evidenced by the increase in data use during the period, as can be seen in this graph. Typical data use increased at the beginning of 2020 due to the purchase of several new devices within the household in early January and a subsequent increase in access to the internet connection for the youngest of the 3 school-aged children. Then there was a marked increase in data use during the lockdown period and an even further increase during remote learning. Now, average daily use from August to December 2019 was 10.5 gigabytes. This increased to 17.5 gigabytes from the beginning of January to the 24th of March, just prior to lockdown, and further to a peak of 27.6 gigabytes a day during remote learning, which is almost triple the August to December 2019 daily average. Once school returned on the 9th of June, data use then returned to a much lower level. So it's anticipated this increase in device and internet use would lead to a subsequent increase in electricity demand, and may be one of the main causes for the increase in electricity demand for April and May in particular. And so the next step was to assess this potential correlation. In the absence of circuit metering for individual devices, the amount of data downloaded through the household's internet connection was compared to the daily electricity demand. And what this showed was that there was a moderate positive correlation of 0.61. So in conclusion, for the household considered, there was a significant increase in electricity demand during lockdown, ranging from 21 to 54% for each month, and averaging 26% over the lockdown period compared to previous years. The extent of this increase is likely to be very case specific, with households where occupancy changed most likely to have seen the greatest increases in energy demand, but many more cases are needed to get a better picture of the different usage patterns, occupancy rates and circumstances specific to individual households, because these are all likely to affect the results. The increased use of technology by all householders appears to be the greatest contributor to the increase in energy demand. Other household energy demands could also be considered in further work, including those associated with transport and the purchase of goods and services within the household. So what we've really seen is just a shift of energy demand from the business and industry sector to the residential sector, with only a minimal overall reduction in demand. However, there are financial implications of this on individual householders. So one of the questions going forward, should working from home become more acceptable and common, is who should be responsible for these expenses, the employer or the employee? Thanks, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch.